The shuttle cut through the darkened sky, its sleek form gliding over a planet that should have been bustling with life. Narvaza, once a shining beacon of human expansion, lay in ruins beneath the dim glow of its dying city lights. Ambassador. Leonard Roy sat rigid in his seat, his fingers wrapped tightly around the armrests. The distress call had come hours ago, fragmented transmissions filled with screams, gunfire, and a chilling silence that followed too soon. The cockpit remained deathly quiet. The pilot, a hardened veteran of diplomatic missions, had nothing to say. There were no words for what lay ahead. As the shuttle descended, the capital city, Meridian, came into full view. Fires smoldered between shattered buildings, casting long shadows over streets littered with bodies. The shuttle's thrusters sent plumes of dust swirling over the charred remains of what had once been a vibrant marketplace. The docking bay, where children once played in the open sun, was a wasteland of twisted metal and scattered debris. The ramp extended with a mechanical hiss. Roy stepped down, his polished diplomatic boots sinking into the blood-streaked pavement. The stench of death thickened the air, pressing against his throat. A figure emerged from the ruins, his combat armor caked in dirt and blood. Captain Elias, Dunn, one of the few survivors. Ambassador, Dunn greeted, his voice hoarse, eyes sunken with exhaustion. We tried. Roy swallowed hard. He had read the reports, tactical summaries, casualty lists, but nothing had prepared him for the sheer weight of it. He looked past Dunn to the silent corpses lined against a crumbling wall. They were small, too small. Children. His chest tightened. The Zver had not simply invaded, they had exterminated. Dunn motioned him forward. There's something you need to see. The streets were unnervingly silent. No sounds of survivors. No movement beyond the flickering embers of the ruined colony. As they walked, the enormity of the massacre unfolded before them. Schools gutted by fire, homes collapsed upon themselves. The scent of charred flesh clung to the wind. Roy had witnessed war, had spoken with dictators and warlords, had seen the cost of political miscalculations. But this was something else. Dunn led him to a collapsed building, once a government hall, now little more than a skeletal frame of shattered concrete and twisted steel. A portable holo display flickered inside, barely functional. We intercepted a transmission before the bastards left, Dunn said. You need to hear this. The display hummed, and then the recording played. A woman's voice, trembling, filled the room. Please, he's just a child. He doesn't understand. We're civilians, we're not fighters. A guttural voice, unmistakably Zver, responded coldly. Your kind bred warriors. The Emperor has deemed it so. A child's cry, barely a whimper. The sound of a plasma shot. The woman's scream, abruptly cut short. Roy exhaled slowly. The recording stopped. He stared at the blank screen, his vision blurring. At the edges. Do we have a count? He finally asked. Dunn hesitated. Total population was 50,000. Less than 1,000 made it to the shelters before evacuation. Most of them. He trailed off, eyes flickering toward the bodies in the street. Roy turned away. He had spent his career keeping humanity out of wars they could not win. He had spent years brokering peace, making concessions, swallowing pride. But there was no peace to be made here, no compromise. The Zver had not attacked, a military outpost. They had not struck down soldiers. They had murdered children, laughing as they did it. As he did so, his breath came slow and measured, his hands curled into fists. Dunn's voice was barely above a whisper. What do we do, sir? For the first time in his career, Roy had no words. The weight of diplomacy, of reason, had been stripped from him. There was nothing left but the cold clarity of purpose. A distant noise cut through the silence. A whimper. Roy and Dunn turned in unison. Near the ruins of a toppled transport, a small figure stirred beneath the debris. Roy rushed forward, shoving aside metal plating with desperate strength. Beneath it, a boy no older than 5 lay curled in a protective, While his face smeared with soot, his clothes torn, Roy crouched, his voice gentler than it had been in years. "Hey there, son. You're safe now." The boy didn't speak. He only stared, wide-eyed, at the ambassador's outstretched hand. A moment passed, and then he moved, slowly, cautiously, placing his tiny, trembling fingers into Roy's palm. Dunn knelt beside them. "We get him to the medics." As he lifted the child, Roy turned back toward the cityscape, his gaze falling upon the distant skyline. The Zver had left their mark, believing that humanity would retreat, would bow, would accept this. As another in a long list of tragedies, they were wrong. He reached into his coat, pulling out the insignia that marked him as a diplomat, a symbol of peace, of negotiation, of words over weapons. He stared at it for a long moment, then tightened his grip and snapped it in half. Dunn raised an eyebrow. "Sir?" Roy straightened, his voice steady. "Prepare the fleet." Dunn hesitated only a second before nodding. There were no protests, no warnings about restraint. The silence between them was understanding. Humanity had always sought peace. But when peace was met with slaughter, there was only one response left. War. As they stepped back toward the shuttle, Roy turned for one last look at Narvaza. Smoke still rose into the sky, the distant fires flickering against the dark horizon. This would not go unanswered, not this time. The halls of Terra Prime's High Senate echoed with a hush, murmurs of uncertainty. Over 100 of humanity's most powerful officials sat in the Grand Assembly chamber, their expressions a mixture of dread and denial. They had seen the footage. Every diplomat, every general, every senator had witnessed the horror of the Narvaza massacre in vivid, undeniable clarity. And yet many clung to the illusion that this could still be solved with words. Leonard Roy stood at the center of the circular chamber, his hands gripping the edge of the speaker's podium. The weight of his broken insignia rested heavily in his pocket, a relic of a past self who might have begged this room for caution. That man was dead, buried under the ashes of a slaughtered colony. "The time for deliberation is over," Roy began, his voice steady, controlled. "We stand at a crossroads. The Zver have slaughtered our children, desecrated our worlds, and sent their mockery of an apology. They expect us to cower, to hesitate, to bicker over treaties while they prepare for the next massacre." Chancellor Alry Voss, an elder statesman known for his restraint, raised a hand. "Ambassador Roy, you are advocating for total war against an empire that outnumbers us 3-1. I grieve for Narvaza, as do we all, but—" Roy slammed his hand against the podium. The sound cracked through the chamber like a gunshot. Then, "Grieve with action, Chancellor. Or shall we compose another apology when the next colony falls? When the next child is executed while begging for mercy?" A ripple of tension passed through the room. Even those who had considered opposing him faltered. The massacre had left its mark. The wounds were too fresh to ignore. A senator from Europa, his uniform stiff with medals, leaned forward. "What do you propose?" Roy let his gaze sweep the room, searching for any sign of weakness, of cowardice. "We declare war. No half measures, no drawn-out sanctions. The Zver do not respect our laws, our treaties, or our pleas for peace. They only understand force, and force is what we will give them." Murmurs swelled once more, but now they carried a different tone. Hesitation laced with the undercurrent of something else. Anger. Admiral Rowan Creed, the legendary tactician who had once commanded the Orion fleet, rose from his seat. His silver hair caught the overhead lights as he studied Roy with an unreadable expression. "Humanity has fought wars before," Creed said, his voice measured, deliberate. "Some just, some foolish. This would be neither." Roy met his gaze, unflinching. "And what would you call it?" Creed's lips curled slightly, though there was no humor in it. "Retribution." Silence fell. The chamber had heard what it needed to. The weight of Creed's endorsement sealed it. The Chancellor's shoulders sagged. "You realize what this means?" His voice had lost its resistance, now laced with resignation. Roy stepped forward. It means we stop pretending we are weak. The war room beneath the Senate chambers had not been used in decades. Dust had settled into the deep recesses of the great hollow table that dominated its center, though it had been quickly wiped clean when word spread of what was coming. Officers, strategists, and soldiers gathered in the dim lighting, their faces a blend of grim determination and cold fury. Roy stood at the table's edge as Admiral Creed and Captain Elias Dunn worked through the logistics of the first offensive strikes. The projected hologram of the Zver Empire flickered in blue light, vast and stretching across multiple sectors. A red streak began forming as Creed mapped out the initial wave of human retaliation. Their military doctrine relies on overwhelming force and intimidation, Creed explained. Eyes. Narrowing his eyes, Creed continued. They don't believe in defensive war. They've never needed to. Dunn exhaled sharply. Then we make them need to. Roy nodded, his mind already calculating the necessary alliances. Humanity's fleet was formidable, but against the Zver war machine it was still outmatched. They needed something more. We need Mars, Roy said. The room fell silent. Even Creed hesitated before responding. The Martian warlords have been independent. For 2 decades, the Admiral said. They don't take orders from Terra. They will now, Roy replied, because I'm not asking. The journey to Mars was swift, but the negotiations would be anything but. The red planet's surface was a rugged expanse of iron and dust, broken only by the towering fortress of the warlords. They had long since abandoned the sleek, polished aesthetics of Terra in favor of raw, functional brutality. The gates of the war citadel stood tall, marked with the scars of past conquests. Inside, the grand arena served as their council chamber. The warlords did not govern through politics, they governed through dominance. At the center of the chamber, 2 massive warriors clashed in a test of strength, their bodies glistening with sweat and blood under the harsh artificial lights. Roy walked past them without flinching. He had faced creatures far worse than men fighting for sport. At the head of the chamber, Warlord Anton Drago sat upon his throne of polished obsidian, his armor gleaming under the dull glow of flickering torches. His dark eyes studied Roy with amusement. Terra sends a diplomat to a world that speaks only in war, Drago mused. Bold. I didn't come as a diplomat, Roy said, his tone sharp. I came to offer you blood. Drago leaned forward. Go on. The Zver have slaughtered our people, Roy continued, his voice steady. And now we march for vengeance, but war demands warriors. And no warriors are greater than those of Mars. Drago chuckled. Flattery won't buy my allegiance. Roy stepped closer, his expression hard. Then name your price. The warlord's amusement faded. You want Mars to bleed for Terra? You want us to abandon our independence and fight for a world that abandoned us? Roy didn't blink. No. I want you to fight for something greater than Mars. I want you to fight for humanity. Because if the Zver are not stopped here, they will come for this world too. And there will be no war. There will only be extermination. Drago studied him for a long moment. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he stood. Then we march. The forces of Mars were only the beginning. Roy traveled to the outer colonies, to the secretive lunar blackguard, to the exiled war veterans of the Eridan Rebellion. One by one, they listened. One by one, they answered the call. By the time he returned to Terra, a force unlike anything humanity had ever assembled stood ready, and, just in time, because the Zver had answered. A transmission from the outer sectors awaited him upon arrival. A Zver emissary stood on the flickering hollow screen, his reptilian features twisted in an expression of mockery. You waste your efforts, human, the emissary hissed. Your fleets are but insects to us, your warriors, nothing but soft flesh, waiting to be crushed beneath our heel. Roy stared at the screen unshaken. You should have killed me on Narvaza. The emissary laughed, a guttural, rasping sound. We do not fear your vengeance. We will cleanse the stars of your kind. Roy leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. Then you should have buried us deeper. He severed the transmission. Dunn stepped forward. What now? Roy turned toward the gathered fleet commanders, the warlords, the soldiers who had come together, under a single purpose. Now, he said, we remind them why humanity endures. The war had begun. The stars above Outpost Sigma 9 shimmered in eerie stillness, a vast ocean of light swallowing the void below. The Zver garrison remained oblivious to the darkness creeping toward them. For decades, their empire had ruled these outer territories unchallenged. They had grown complacent, arrogant, certain that humanity would remain as they always had, fractured, weak, too restrained by their morality to strike first. Tonight, that illusion shattered. From the abyss of space, the human fleet emerged, silent, shadows against the cosmic backdrop, their warships cutting through the void with ruthless precision. Admiral Rowan Creed stood on the bridge of the HSS Revenant, his steely gaze locked onto the enemy station through the viewport. The Zver forces were barely mobilizing, their fleet anchored in low orbit, unaware that death had already arrived. Their shields are down, a lieutenant reported, voice taut. With anticipation, Creed's lips pressed into a thin line. Open fire! Lances of energy surged from the human warships, slicing through the void like divine retribution. The first Zver cruiser exploded before it could raise its defenses, a brilliant bloom of fire swallowing the black. Another took a direct hit to its engines, spiraling into the atmosphere below, flames licking at its hull as it plummeted toward the surface. On the ground, Captain Elias Dunn led the first wave of the assault. His boots hit the ground running, his rifle raised as he charged forward with his squad, Martian warlords beside him. The Zver outpost erupted into chaos, their sentries scrambling to respond. Too late. Humanity had learned from every war they had ever fought, from every empire that had underestimated them. Dunn's weapon barked fire as he cut down an enemy officer, his squad sweeping through the base with relentless efficiency. The Martians fought like demons, their bodies augmented for war, their blades carving through Zver flesh with merciless precision. The enemy, so used to striking first, now found themselves on the receiving end of unrestrained fury. A Zver commander, his armor glistening in the flickering light of battle, snarled as he raised his plasma weapon. Dunn didn't hesitate. A single shot pierced through the alien's skull, the body collapsing in a heap. The ground campaign lasted only an hour. The Zver, outnumbered and unprepared, fell in droves. Their war machines, once symbols of terror, were reduced to smoldering wreckage. Their banners, once flying high, were trampled beneath human boots. By dawn, Outpost Sigma 9 was a graveyard. Dunn stood amidst the ruins, his rifle still warm in his hands. Roy's voice crackled through his earpiece. Status? Dunn exhaled slowly, scanning the bodies strewn across the compound. It's done. Silence stretched between them. Then Roy spoke again, his voice quieter, more deliberate. Burn it. Dunn hesitated only a moment before giving the order. Fire consumed the remains of the outpost. This scene has incredible intensity and momentum. You're really nailing the sense of escalating stakes and the brutal, no-turning-back nature of the war. The themes of vengeance, sacrifice, and desperation come through vividly. A few areas you might refine: pacing and sentence flow. Some sections could use slight restructuring for smoother readability. Right now the action is relentless, which is great, but a few well-placed pauses could enhance impact. Character depth: Roy, Dunn, and Creed are compelling, but you could add just a touch more interiority, especially in moments like Creed's final stand or Roy deciding to take the homeworld. A sentence or two showing what's going through their minds beyond tactical calculations would deepen emotional resonance. Strategic descriptions: the space battles are thrilling, but refining. The tactical details, how formations shift, how specific ships engage, could elevate them further. A bit more distinction between different classes of ships and their roles might add even more realism. Thematic reinforcement: the phrase "make it count" is excellent, but you could thread that idea through the story more, perhaps reflecting on earlier losses that shaped Roy's brutal resolve. This is a powerful and brutal conclusion, epic in scale, yet personal in its weight. The final moments, with the Zveir choosing annihilation over surrender, are especially striking. The themes of vengeance, the cycle of war, and the cost of victory are well executed, and Roy's final reflection on the next empire rising is chillingly effective. Strengths: cinematic action, the drop pods, the ground assault, and the final confrontation in the throne room all feel intense and visually striking. Moral complexity: the Emperor's recognition of the cycle of war adds depth, and Roy's lack of hesitation in executing him is a strong character moment. Poignant. Ending: for the next empire to rise is a great final line, reinforcing the endless nature of war. Areas for refinement, pacing, and sentence flow. The rapid-fire sentences keep up the momentum, but a few could be varied for impact. A pause before key moments, e.g., before Roy pulls the trigger as the failsafe activates, would add more weight, more internal reflection. Roy's detachment is clear, but a little more introspection could enhance his transformation. Does he feel victorious? Hollow? Has he changed permanently? Smoother transitions. The battle and planetary destruction happen at breakneck speed. A bit more description between sequences, like the shift from execution to planetary failsafe activation, would give the reader a second to absorb the gravity of each moment.